Hello, everybody. This is my we're under evacuation warning again. Crazy look from fires, so I didn't sleep all night. I usually finish my videos in the evening and upload them, but last night was just a little bit too nutty, and so here I am, and this is what I look like when I wake up, and I'm totally not together with myself, other than I just put on some fancy earrings so I could feel better about myself. Anyways, this week we are talking about demographic comorbidities, race, ethnicity, and the impact of racism on mental health and emotional health. A comorbidity is something that is in addition to something else, and so you should probably know that from all your other sort of public health courses. And so a comorbidity of mental health would be other sort of things that affect your mental health. And so the demographic comorbidity that we're talking about this week is race ethnicity. So how does race ethnicity impact mental health? How does it impact mental illness? Particularly when we're talking about sort of systemic issues like racism, structural racism, other sort of interactive prejudice and these sort of things. And so we should have probably a wide view, if you've taken 328 or some of the other sort of classes, that race ethnicity really matters. We know that race is a social construct, and we know that ethnicity is something that is kind of weird and nebulous that we define, and yet those things have real impacts in real life. And so we know that race ethnicity can have a major impact on mental health. Some of the issues and concerns that are at the forefront is discrimination and bias, right? Discrimination being we treat people differently than other people because we have some sort of idea of these sort of things. And then bias is just those internal sort of things that we hold on to that are dominant messages from sort of society. Doesn't mean that we're racist. It just means that we have learned these sort of things to associate different kinds of people and things with different sort of ideas. So one of the things that I really like to point out is that discrimination and bias can, yes, happen on a very personal sort of level. So somebody being called a name or somebody being treated differently because of these sort of things. But oftentimes bias and discrimination are unintentional, and they happen on institutional levels, which is actually the bigger sort of picture. When we think about structural racism, when we think about things that are built into our system that we don't necessarily recognize, those are big things that often cause some of the biggest harms to communities of color, is because they aren't intentional. They are very unintentional. They're built into systems in these sort of ways. We'll talk about more about what that means as we go through these lecture slides. So the concept of microaggressions is a really important one for all sorts of reasons, but for mental health particularly, microaggressions are really important because microaggressions are those little tiny things in a day that add up that don't feel good. If somebody is like, oh, well, all black people are basketball players, or Native Americans are all alcoholics, or all these other sort of things, in and of itself, not a huge deal, right? You didn't die from somebody saying that sort of thing, but it hurts at a wound sort of level. I like to think of microaggressions as death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Everybody's had a paper cut. It's the worst, stupid sort of injury, right? It stings, it hurts, you're like, but it's really just this little tiny sort of thing. Microaggressions are like paper cuts, right? It's this little tiny thing. It's not going to kill you, but it doesn't feel good, right? Now imagine that you got 100 microaggressions in one day, or 100 paper cuts in one day, or 1,000 paper cuts in one day. And over the sort of period of your life, all those little tiny cuts add up, right? And so when we think about these sort of things, yeah, maybe that one sort of thing that came up didn't really make a huge deal. It stung, it didn't feel really great, but imagine that happening all day, every day. That's what a microaggression is. And for people who are different, so whether it be communities of color, whether it be LGBTQ people, anybody who gets these little tiny messages that somehow you're different, you're not okay, and we're gonna do these like little crappy things that are not necessarily that big, those are those sort of things. There's a concept called race-related stress. We know that people who experience stress, or who are experiencing the stress of feeling discriminated against, is very real, right? Whether or not the discrimination or the bias was intended, or whether it was something that was overt, we know that perception is reality. When people go through life thinking, hey, people don't like me because I'm different, that's absolutely something that is perceived and real and has an effect on our mental health. To top that off, oftentimes people are like, no, it has nothing to do with that. And so you're gaslit on top of it. Gaslighting is the concept that something is happening and then somebody tells you absolutely it's not happening, right? And so when somebody says, no, I think that they were treating me differently because of my race, and then people are like, no, that didn't happen. Then not only did you experience sort of the perception of like, oh, I was treated differently, but now also somebody's telling me I wasn't treated differently, right? And so that becomes a really heavy sort of thing to bear in terms of mental health. When we talk about intersectionality and privilege, those things are really important. Again, if you've taken 328, you know these sort of concepts, but the idea that we experience different parts of our identity in different sorts of ways, right? So if you're a Black woman, you're experiencing the microaggressions, the discrimination and bias of being a Black person, but also the discrimination and bias of being a woman in a society that is dominantly patriarchal, right? And so we think about these sort of things of not only are you experiencing maybe your microaggressions, your discrimination, your bias against communities of color, but other identities that you may have, whether it be LGBTQ status, whether it be gender, whether it be socioeconomic status, all of those sort of things all add up. Now, when we think about safety, violence in marginalized communities is something that happens, whether it be violence to marginalized communities or violence within marginalized communities. We know that those things don't just happen in a vacuum. They oftentimes are happening for other sort of reasons, such as socioeconomic status, such as poverty, such as other sort of things. And so when you are constantly feeling at threat for your life, well, yeah, that's going to weigh on your mental health a lot, right? Now, the important thing to remember is that being a person of color is not something that causes mental health issues, right? What causes mental health issues is the treatment that you receive for being a person of color in a society that wasn't built and intended for you from sort of the beginning of the structure. That's why we call it structural racism. It's not individual sort of stuff. It's built into the system. And so, yeah, a lot of that causes some mental health issues, but it doesn't mean that you have mental health issues because you're a person of color, okay? So in terms of thinking about how do we talk about these sort of things, well, there's a lot of different cultures that have lots of different beliefs around mental health. Some cultures are just like, yeah, mental health isn't a thing. It's just, it's a white people thing or it's an American thing. And if your family doesn't believe in mental health or really doubts that it's a thing, you can imagine how that's really going to weigh on you. Again, it's that sort of gaslighting thing of like, yeah, no, really, I'm having mental health issues. And your family's like, yeah, no, that's not a thing. That feels really, really bad, right? Some cultures still have a lot of strong historically tied beliefs around mental health being struggled to sort of religious beliefs or mystical in sort of nature. Your chi is out of whack. You have done something bad and angered the gods. Well, that makes it really hard to address sort of the Western medicine perspectives of mental health, right? If your family is just like, no, you just need to pray harder or you just need to do certain sort of rituals, well, then that makes it a little bit harder to go into getting help in sort of pharmacological or therapeutic ways. And then a lot of cultures just plain don't want to acknowledge it. They're just like, yeah, that's not a thing. You're fine. Just get over it. Work harder. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, those sort of messages. And again, if we can't acknowledge that there's a problem, we can't really address it, right? So when we think about mental health services, there's also a lot of issues around access and comfortability. So access being, can you even access mental health services? As we talked about in the past 2 weeks, mental health services can be very expensive, right? Especially for therapy. And so a lot of people don't have the financial means to access therapy. In addition, we have to think about insurance coverage and what kind of insurance people have, right? We know that with the Affordable Care Act, more and more people have insurance coverage, but most health insurance doesn't cover well or adequately mental health services. And so if you don't have access to it through insurance and then you don't have the money to pay out of pocket, the likelihood that you're going to be able to access those things are pretty low. Other sort of issues are that a lot of people, when they go to therapy, they're going to have to find somebody who doesn't look like them, right? Which doesn't seem like such a bad deal, right? We're in this whole idea of like, oh, people are people, except for it does, right? Cultural competency is a really big issue. And so if you seek therapy and you can't find somebody that looks like you, that's a pretty big deal. And so a lot of people don't feel comfortable going to somebody who has a different race or a different ethnicity or a different gender than them. A lot of us want to talk to somebody who understands us at a soul-based sort of level. level. And so for a lot of people, it's just hard. Even if they do have the access, they're like, yeah, I just don't feel like navigating this sort of system just to find somebody who's not really going to understand me. And I'm going to have to educate them about my community in addition to seeking services. Additionally, and sort of the last point I wanted to make is that oftentimes communities that have low sort of belief in mental health care have big histories of sort of stigma and are relatively new to the system, just don't know how to navigate the system, right? Finding a therapist is hard work. Navigating through sort of doctors and knowing how to talk to people about different sort of pharmacologies is a really complicated process. If your family and sort of your culture doesn't have a history of doing that, it can be really daunting. And so for a lot of people, maybe the will is there, the desire is there, maybe they have the access, but they're just like, oh, it's just so exhausting. I don't even know how to do this. And I can't ask anybody in my family for help because they don't even have any sort of concept of this. We've seen a lot of different cultures and communities come up sort of with alternative coping mechanisms. Oftentimes they say, you know, you don't need to go to a therapist. You don't need to go tell somebody your problems. You just need to pray. And so it's not a surprise that a lot of faith communities provide a lot of mental and emotional support for people of color in different sort of ways. A lot of other people will do other sort of things such as fasting or maybe dancing, other sort of rituals that are non-therapeutic from the Western perspective. But what we know is that in the absence of sort of other care, a lot of these things are very helpful. Are they the best sort of things? Well, that's a cultural sort of judgment. Is it the best? But what we know is that for a lot of people, cultural sort of community alternatives are actually very therapeutic and helpful in absence of anything else. And so we never want to poo-poo those sort of ideas and say like, oh, well, don't do those sort of things, because if it's something that somebody finds helpful, well, then we want to encourage that, because we want everybody to be able to do self-care in whatever way that they can and whatever way feels comfortable. Okay, so that is the big picture of things this week. There are several different videos for you to watch to think about sort of these bigger sort of effects of experiencing racism and being a person of color in a system that is set up specifically in a way to structurally disadvantage you, to make you feel kind of like crap. So today's moment of Zen is deep pressure therapy, sometimes called squeeze therapy. This again was something that originated into the sort of autism spectrum. You might have heard of Temple Grandin, who is a very famous animal behaviorist. She herself has autism, and she has worked a lot with sort of therapeutic practices for animals. To find out what calms people. And what she found through her research is that people who are squeezed or are weighted down in some sort of way actually feel calmer, which seems sort of counterintuitive to a lot of people. A lot of people are like, no, I feel trapped. Don't do those sort of things. But what we have found is that for people with autism, but also people with other sort of anxiety disorders, this deep pressure feeling actually helps to ground us. And so there are lots of different sort of things. You might have noticed the rise of weighted blankets in the past couple of years. Weighted blankets are the idea that if you have something that is slightly pressurizing and it is holding you down in some sort of way, that oftentimes that feels really good. It helps to ground you and to calm you. People who like having their pets lay on them, yeah, that's not a mistake. That's actually a different kind of deep pressure therapy with the addition of cuddling and those sort of things. And so think about those sort of things. Why do hugs feel good? Often because they're a very pressured sort of thing. A lot of these things are important in terms of feeling good about ourselves. Okay, take care of yourself, and I'll take care of me, and I'll see you next week.